I am George, 63 years old, and for the last 6 years my entire world was confined to the four walls of a bedroom, caring for my paralyzed wife, Cynthia. I thought I was watching her slowly slip away from a devastating medical condition. But everything changed on a Tuesday evening when an emergency room doctor looked at her pill bottles, turned pale, and whispered, "Call the police." Before I reveal the nightmare my own family orchestrated behind my back, let me know where you are watching this from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you believe that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the light. For 4 decades, I built bridges and highways as a civil engineer. I was a man who understood load-bearing walls, stress fractures, and foundations. I knew how to make things last. But nothing prepares you for the collapse of your own life. 6 years ago, Cynthia suffered what the doctors called a catastrophic neurological event. They said it was a severe atypical stroke. Almost overnight, my vibrant, beautiful wife, the woman who used to drag me to jazz clubs and hike mountain trails, was trapped in her own body. She could barely speak, restricted to agonizingly slow blinks and slight twitches of her fingers. I retired immediately. I traded blueprints and hard hats for pureed food sponge baths and medication charts. Every morning began at 5. My knees would pop as I rolled out of bed to check her vitals. I installed a hydraulic lift in our ceiling just to move her from the bed to her wheelchair. I memorized the exact angle to prop her pillows so she would not choke. I became a nurse, a physical therapist, and a pharmacist, all rolled into one. And I did it without a single complaint, because when you love someone, caretaking is not a burden. It is a privilege. But the medications were an endless, exhausting puzzle. We were following a strict regimen prescribed by a private specialist, a doctor highly recommended by Cynthia's son from her first marriage, Cameron. Cameron was 38, a charismatic investment broker who drove imported cars and wore suits that cost more than my first truck. I had raised Cameron since he was 10. I paid for his college. I bought his first apartment. I treated him as my own flesh and blood. But as Cynthia's condition worsened, Cameron's visits became less about a son seeing his mother and more about an auditor checking on a failing asset. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when Cameron stopped by with his wife, Monica. Monica ran a boutique lifestyle brand that never seemed to actually sell anything, yet she always arrived draped in designer labels. They did not knock. They just pushed through the front door, bringing a gust of cold wind and the overpowering scent of expensive perfume into our quiet, sterile sanctuary. Monica immediately wrinkled her nose. She stood in the hallway, refusing to step fully into the living room where Cynthia was resting in her medical chair. "It smells like a hospital ward in here, George." Monica sighed, waving a manicured hand in front of her face. "You really need to open some windows. It is depressing." I looked at Cynthia. I could see the slight tremor in her jaw, the only way she could express humiliation. I calmly explained that the draft would make her muscles cramp, but Monica was already scrolling through her phone, completely disinterested. Cameron walked in, barely glancing at his mother. He did not kiss her forehead. He did not ask how her physical therapy was going. Instead, he walked straight to the kitchen counter where I was sorting the evening pills. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, adopting that practiced, persuasive tone he used on his clients. "Dad, we need to have a serious talk about reality," Cameron began. "Her care is getting astronomically expensive. I know you are burning through your pension to afford these specialists and the home equipment." I kept my eyes on the pill organizer. I did not mention that I had never once asked him for a dime. I let him talk. He pulled a glossy folder from his briefcase and slid it onto the counter. "I have been looking at the equity in this house. The market is peaking right now. If we refinance, we could pull out enough cash to move Mom into a premium facility, somewhere where professionals can handle this. It is too much for you, Dad. You look exhausted. It is time to be practical." I looked at the folder. It was a reverse mortgage application. He was asking me to sign away the house, the only home Cynthia felt safe in, under the guise of compassion. I looked at Monica, who was staring out the window, tapping her designer heels impatiently. Then I looked back at Cameron. His eyes were cold, calculating. He was not looking at a father figure. He was looking at a stubborn obstacle standing between him and a payout. I simply pushed the folder back across the counter. "Not today, Cameron. Cynthia stays here. Her comfort is not negotiable." Cameron's jaw tightened. He snatched the folder back, his fake smile dropping for just a fraction of a second. "You cannot hold on forever, George. We have to think about the future." They left less than 10 minutes later. As the front door clicked shut, the silence of the house returned, but the air felt heavy, tainted by their impatience. I walked over to Cynthia, taking her frail hand in mine. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, desperate energy I had not seen in months. I thought she was just upset by their visit. I kissed her knuckles and went to get her evening water and the pills Cameron's specialist had prescribed. I carefully placed the capsules on her tongue and helped her swallow. I turned my back for just 1 second to turn off the kitchen light. That was when I heard the terrible, suffocating gasp. I spun around. Cynthia was convulsing. Her entire body was locked in a rigid, violent tremor. Her eyes rolled back and a horrible rattling sound tore from her throat. The wheelchair shook violently against the hardwood floor. It was not a normal spasm. It was sheer, catastrophic systemic failure. Pure adrenaline took over. I bypassed 911, knowing the ambulance would take too long to navigate our suburban streets. I scooped her into my arms, ignoring the agonizing burn in my back, and carried her to the car. I broke every speed limit, driving like a madman to the local emergency room, praying aloud the entire way. When I carried her through the sliding glass doors, the medical staff descended immediately. They ripped her away from me, rushing her through a set of double doors. A nurse held me back, asking a barrage of questions about her history. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely open her medical bag. I handed the nurse her thick file and the plastic bag containing all of her daily pill bottles. I paced that sterile waiting room for 2 hours, my clothes soaked in sweat, my mind racing with absolute terror. Finally, the attending physician, a young doctor with a grim, pale face, stepped through the doors. He did not look like a man bringing a diagnosis. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He pulled me into a small, windowless consultation room and closed the door tightly. He placed the bag of Cynthia's pills on the metal table between us. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Barrett, your wife did not have a seizure. She is experiencing acute heavy metal toxicity. I ran the labs twice. These pills you gave me, they are not blood pressure medications. Someone has been intentionally poisoning her for a very long time. You need to call the police right now." The fluorescent lights of the emergency room buzzed with a low, relentless hum that seemed to vibrate straight into my teeth. I paced the scuffed linoleum floor, counting the gray tiles just to keep my mind from shattering into 1,000 pieces. The smell of bleach and rubbing alcohol hung heavy in the air, a sterile scent that completely failed to mask the sheer desperation breathing within those walls. Every time the double doors swung open, my heart stopped hoping for news of my wife, while simultaneously fearing the absolute worst. I kept seeing Cynthia in my mind, her body locked in that unnatural, violent tremor on our kitchen floor. 6 years of careful routine, 6 years of holding my breath through every minor cough or fever had culminated in this agonizing waiting game. I gripped the cold plastic of the waiting room chair, feeling the deep ache in my lower back from carrying her to the car. I was a builder, a man who spent his entire life measuring stress and load capacities, calculating exactly how much weight a structure could bear before it collapsed. But sitting there in that cold room, I realized I had no mathematical equation to measure the breaking point of a human soul. An hour bled into 2. The nurses at the triage desk avoided my gaze, their eyes firmly locked on their glowing computer screens. That is never a good sign in a hospital. When the medical staff looks through you instead of at you, It usually means they are carrying a truth too heavy to casually hand over. Finally, the swinging doors pushed open, and the young attending physician, Dr. Evans, stepped into the waiting area. He did not have his clipboard out. He was not walking with the brisk, confident stride of a man moving to his next patient. He looked physically ill. His skin was pale, and his eyes held a mixture of deep sorrow and something else, something that looked chillingly like sheer terror. He caught my eye and gestured silently toward a small, windowless consultation room down the hall. My legs felt like lead, but I followed him. The room was suffocatingly small, containing only a round laminate table and 2 uncomfortable chairs. Dr. Evans closed the heavy wooden door behind us, ensuring it latched completely. The click of that lock sounded like a gavel falling in an empty courtroom. He asked me to please sit down, his voice lacking any of the usual clinical detachment I was used to hearing from specialists. I did not sit. I could not bring myself to lower my body into a chair, while my wife, fate, hung in the balance. I pleaded with him to just tell me what was happening to her, my voice cracking under the weight of my fear. I asked if it was another stroke, if there was more brain damage, if we were losing her. Dr. Evans took a deep breath, running a trembling hand over his face. He looked at me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. He told me that she did not have a stroke. His tone was steady but incredibly quiet, as if he were afraid someone was listening through the walls. He said that based on the preliminary scans and the comprehensive blood panels they just rushed through the lab, he was highly confident she did not have a stroke 6 years ago either. I stared at him, the words floating in the air between us, completely devoid of sense. I told him that was impossible. I had been there. I had seen her collapse 6 years ago. I had spoken to the top specialists in the city. The doctor reached into the deep pocket of his white coat and pulled out the clear plastic evidence bag I had handed to the triage nurse. Inside were the orange prescription bottles, the very pills my stepson Cameron had brought over, the pills his highly recommended private specialist had insisted were keeping Cynthia alive. Dr. Evans placed the bag on the metal table. The plastic crinkled loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. He explained that they ran a full toxicology screen because her symptoms presented as a massive neurological shock, not a vascular blockage. Her blood work came back with off-the-chart levels of a synthetic heavy metal compound. He described it as a highly toxic substance that, when administered in small, consistent doses, mimics the exact neurological deterioration of a severe stroke. It causes muscle paralysis, vocal cord stiffening, and eventually complete respiratory failure. He pushed the plastic bag closer to me. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "These aren't blood pressure meds, Mr. Barrett. Call the police." The walls of the room seemed to tilt inward. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights suddenly sounded like a roaring freight train in my ears. Poisoned. The word echoed in my mind, refusing to anchor itself to reality. Someone had been intentionally poisoning my wife for a very long time. I reached out and touched the plastic bag, staring at the typed labels bearing the name of Cameron, hand-picked doctor. 6 years. 6 agonizing years of feeding my wife these capsules, watching her body wither away, watching her lose her voice, her mobility, her dignity. 6 years of Cameron coming over, patting my back, shaking his head in fake sorrow, while he personally ensured her prescriptions were always fully stocked. I remembered how he insisted on managing her pharmacy pickups, claiming he wanted to save me the exhausting trip. I remembered his visit earlier that afternoon, the way he coldly pushed the reverse mortgage papers across the kitchen counter. The puzzle pieces crashed together with a violent, sickening clarity that made my stomach churn. He was not trying to help her. He was carefully, meticulously murdering his own mother. He needed her estate. He needed the house. He needed her gone. But he needed it to look completely natural, so no legal authority would ever question the inheritance. He had trapped her in her own body, turning her into a silent prisoner while he slowly drained the life from her veins. Dr. Evans placed a steady hand on my shoulder, grounding me, bringing me back to the cold, sterile room. He whispered that he had already initiated a secure transfer to the intensive care unit. They were flushing her system with chelating agents to bind the heavy metals and remove them from her blood. He promised me she was going to survive the night, but he warned me that I could not take her back to that house. I could not trust anyone who had access to her daily medications. I nodded slowly as the initial paralyzing shock began to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, absolute rage. A rage so profound it froze the blood in my veins. I had spent my life building massive structures designed to withstand hurricanes and earthquakes, but the foundation of my own family had been rotting from the inside out, eaten away by pure, unchecked greed. I thanked Dr. Evans, my voice sounding completely unrecognizable even to myself. I instructed him to keep her under strict guard, to allow absolutely no visitors, regardless of their relation to her, and to register her under a pseudonym, to keep her presence hidden. I stepped out of the consultation room, the world looking completely different than it had 20 minutes prior. Every shadow looked darker, every sound felt amplified. I walked toward the emergency room exit, needing fresh air, needing to breathe, without inhaling the scent of antiseptic and brutal betrayal. I pushed through the sliding glass doors into the cool night. Rain was beginning to mist, falling lightly on the damp pavement. I stood under the hospital overhang, reaching into my pocket for my phone to dial the authorities, just as the doctor had instructed. But before my thumb could press the first digit, a sleek black luxury SUV turned sharply into the emergency drop-off lane. The bright halogen headlights washed over me, temporarily blinding me in the dark. The expensive vehicle parked illegally right against the red curb. The driver's side door swung open, and Cameron stepped out into the mist. He was still wearing his immaculate tailored suit, looking perfectly put together, perfectly concerned, perfectly fake. Monica stepped out from the passenger side, clutching her designer purse, fixing her face into a practiced mask of worried tragedy. They were here to check on their investment. They were here to see if the final concentrated dose had done its job, if the house was finally theirs to liquidate. I slowly slipped my phone back into my pocket, letting my hand fall to my side. Calling the police right now would be too easy. It would tip him off immediately. It would give him a chance to hire expensive lawyers to destroy financial evidence to build a bulletproof alibi. No, I was a master builder, and I knew exactly how to demolish a structure so that nothing remained but ash and dust. I watched my stepson jog toward the entrance, his face twisted in mock panic. He thought he was coming to comfort a grieving widower and collect his massive inheritance. He had absolutely no idea he had just walked into his own grave. The automatic doors of the emergency room slid open, and Cameron rushed through them. He was out of breath, his tie slightly askew, playing the part of the frantic, devoted son to absolute perfection. Monica trailed behind him, the clicking of her heels sharp and demanding against the linoleum. They spotted me immediately. I was sitting on one of the uncomfortable vinyl chairs, my elbows resting on my knees, my face buried in my hands. The physical posture of a broken man was easy to assume because my world had indeed just shattered. But the man waiting for them was no longer the exhausted, compliant stepfather. The man waiting for them had spent 40 years building infrastructures meant to endure extreme pressure. The silent adjustment had begun. I forced my breathing to remain shallow and erratic, keeping my shoulders slumped as Cameron knelt in front of me. "Dad, what happened?" He demanded, his voice laced with an urgency that I now knew was not born of love but of panic. "Is she okay? What did the doctors say?" I looked up at him, letting the genuine exhaustion of the past 6 years wash over my features. I made sure my hands were visibly shaking as I reached up to run them through my thinning hair. "I don't know, Cameron," I stammered, leaning into the persona of the bewildered old man. "It happened so fast. She just started seizing. They rushed her into the back. They won't tell me anything. I don't understand. She was fine this morning. I gave her the evening pills just like always." At the mention of the pills, Cameron's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, a microscopic tell that I would have missed if I wasn't looking for it. He stood up quickly, adjusting his suit jacket, looking around the waiting room as if assessing the threat level. "We need to get her out of here, Dad," he said, his tone shifting from frantic to authoritative. "This is a public hospital. It is chaotic. It is understaffed. They don't know her history. They don't understand her specific needs. I'll call Dr. Aris right now. We need to transfer her to the Sunset Horizon Clinic immediately. It is private, quiet, and they have the exact facilities she requires." Sunset Horizon. I recognized the name. It was a high-end, long-term care facility on the outskirts of the city, known for its discretion and lack of rigorous oversight. It was a place where wealthy families sent their inconvenient relatives to fade away quietly. Monica chimed in, stepping closer, but still keeping a pristine distance. "Cameron is right, George. This place is a nightmare. It is completely unsuitable for Cynthia. She needs specialized care somewhere peaceful where she can rest properly without all these alarms and strange people." I looked at Monica, her perfectly applied makeup, and her cold, detached eyes, and I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat. I nodded slowly, playing along. "But the doctors here, they are running tests," I mumbled, my voice trembling convincingly. "They said she is critical, Cameron. They said she can't be moved." Cameron leaned in close, lowering his voice, attempting to sound reassuring, but the underlying pressure was unmistakable. "They always say that, Dad. It is a liability issue. But we have rights. We know what is best for her. Dr. Aris can authorize the transfer, but we need to act fast before they start administering unnecessary treatments that could interfere with her current regimen." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a tri-folded document. The paper looked pristine, out of place in the sterile, chaotic environment of the emergency room. He unfolded it and smoothed it out on the empty chair beside me. "I already had my lawyer draft this up just in case of an emergency like this," he explained, his voice smooth and persuasive. "It is a medical proxy transfer. It gives me the authority to handle the logistics of moving her and dealing with the hospital administration, so you don't have to worry about the red tape. You just focus on Mom. Just sign the bottom line, and I will take care of everything. I will handle Dr. Aris. I will arrange the private transport. You just need to sign." He pulled an expensive silver pen from his breast pocket and held it out to me. The silver glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. I looked at the pen, then down at the dense legal jargon printed on the page. I recognized the formatting immediately. It wasn't just a simple medical transfer form. It was a comprehensive delegation of medical authority. If I signed that paper, I was effectively stripping myself of all decision-making power regarding my wife's care. I would be handing her executioner the keys to her hospital room. The pressure from Cameron was palpable. He was hovering over me, the silver pen extended, his eyes fixed intently on my face. He needed this signature, and he needed it right now. The urgency radiated from him, cutting through his carefully constructed facade of concern. If Cynthia regained consciousness, if she showed signs of improvement, under the care of doctors outside of his control, his entire meticulously crafted plan would crumble. He needed to get her back into an isolated environment where he could control access to her, where Dr. Aris could continue whatever lethal protocol they had established. I reached out slowly, my hand shaking violently. I took the silver pen from his grasp, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I lowered the pen toward the signature line, but stopped hovering just millimeters above the paper. I squinted at the text, leaning closer, letting out a frustrated sigh. "I can't read it, Cameron," I said, my voice pathetic and wavering. The words are all blurry. I was so rushed, I left my reading glasses on the kitchen counter. "I can't sign something I can't read, son. You know that." Cameron's frustration flared, his facade cracking. "Dad, it is just a standard form." He insisted, his voice rising slightly, before he caught himself and lowered it again. "You don't need to read it. I am telling you what it says. I am trying to help you. I am trying to help Mom. Just sign it. We don't have time to go back to the house for your glasses." Monica crossed her arms, tapping her foot. "Honestly, George, this is ridiculous. Cynthia is suffering and you are worrying about reading glasses. Just sign the paper. I shook my head stubbornly, maintaining the persona of the confused, helpless old man. I can't do it, Cameron. I just can't. My hands won't stop shaking. I can't focus. Let's just wait to hear what the doctors here say first. Maybe she is stabilizing. Let's just wait. Cameron snatched the pen from my hand, his knuckles white. Fine, he snapped, his voice tight with suppressed rage. We will wait. But the second they give us an update, we are moving her. He turned and paced toward the emergency room doors, pulling his phone from his pocket. Monica rolled her eyes and followed him. I watched them walk away, my shaking hands instantly steadying as I rested them on my knees. The terrified, confused husband vanished, replaced entirely by the pragmatic engineer evaluating a critical structural failure. Cameron's desperation was blindingly obvious. He had planned to slowly poison his mother over years, creating the illusion of a natural decline. But the sudden violent seizure was an anomaly, a miscalculation in his dosage. He was panicking. He needed that medical proxy immediately to cover his tracks. But why the extreme rush? Why the need for total control tonight? A slow, deliberate poisoning requires patience. It requires time. Unless he was out of time. Unless there was an external pressure forcing his hand. Unless the slow death he had planned for his mother was suddenly not fast enough to solve whatever catastrophic problem was looming in his own life. The drive back to our suburban home felt entirely different this time. For 6 years, that house had been my sanctuary and my prison. But stepping through the front door tonight, it felt like walking into a crime scene. The silence of the empty rooms was deafening. There was no hum of my wife's oxygen concentrator, no soft, classical music playing from the corner radio. The living room still smelled faintly of Monica and her expensive perfume, a lingering reminder of the predators circling my family. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the worn Formica countertops. To Cameron and Monica, this house was a pathetic monument to a mediocre life. They looked at the faded wallpaper, the outdated appliances, and the scuffed hardwood floors, and they saw exactly what I wanted them to see. They saw a tired, retired civil engineer surviving on a meager pension, scraping by on Social Security checks, and drowning under the weight of mounting medical bills. They looked at my faded flannel shirts and my 10-year-old sedan, and believed they had the absolute upper hand. They thought the equity in this modest 4-bedroom house was the only asset left to my name. They thought I was a desperate man clinging to a sinking ship. They were so incredibly, fatally wrong. I was not just a man who poured concrete and measured load-bearing walls. Decades ago, while Cameron was busy racking up credit card debt and begging his mother for bailouts, I was spending my nights in the garage sketching blueprints. I had designed a specialized structural safety valve. It was a pressure release mechanism for high-capacity aqueducts and commercial dams, preventing catastrophic pressure failures. It was a niche invention, but it solved a massive global infrastructure problem, saving cities from flooding and governments from billion-dollar lawsuits. 10 years ago, a multinational engineering conglomerate purchased the exclusive rights to my patents. The buyout was $15 million. I never told Cameron. I never even told Cynthia. I knew my wife better than anyone. She had a heart of pure gold and a blind spot the size of a canyon when it came to her son. If she knew we had millions, she would have given Cameron whatever he asked for. He would have drained the accounts for his flashy cars, his fake lifestyle brand for Monica, and his endless string of bad investments. I loved Cynthia too much to let her son turn her into a human bank account. So I took the buyout and placed every single penny into an ironclad blind trust. I set it up so that the money grew quietly, compounding in the shadows, while Cynthia and I continued our simple, happy life. I paid off the mortgage. I bought groceries. I lived exactly as I had always lived. But now, standing in the quiet kitchen, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying precision. Cameron thought I was broke. He thought the house was the final prize. but a reverse mortgage on a suburban house would yield maybe $300,000. That is a lot of money to a normal person, but to a man who wears $5,000 suits and leases luxury vehicles, it is pocket change. It was not enough to justify 6 years of slow, meticulous poisoning. It was not enough to justify matricide. There had to be something else. He was looking for something bigger. The sudden insistence on private doctors made sense now. The absolute refusal to let Cynthia visit a standard public hospital was a calculated effort to keep her medical records entirely out of the mainstream system. He needed a death certificate signed by his corrupted specialist to ensure a smooth transition of assets. But what assets? Why was a man who allegedly managed millions for high-profile clients willing to kill for a modest suburban property? There had to be a hidden variable, something I was missing. I walked out the back door and headed toward my detached workshop. The cool night air felt sharp against my face, clearing the last remnants of shock from my mind. I unlocked the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The shop smelled of sawdust and old motor oil. I walked past the table saws and the drill presses, heading straight for the back corner, where an enormous cast iron tool cabinet stood against the brick wall. It weighed nearly 400 pounds fully loaded. To anyone else, it was an immovable object. To me, it was a carefully engineered false front. I reached under the bottom shelf, feeling for the hidden hydraulic release lever I had machined myself. I pressed it, and the massive cabinet rolled smoothly to the side on a concealed track, revealing a section of the concrete floor. I knelt down and brushed away a layer of sawdust, exposing a heavy steel plate. I lifted the plate, uncovering a biometric keypad. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green scanner. A satisfying mechanical clank echoed through the quiet workshop as the floor safe unlocked. I reached inside and pulled out a sleek black shock-proof briefcase. I had not opened this case in 6 years. I had locked it away the day Cynthia collapsed, believing my days of corporate maneuvering were permanently behind me. I carried the briefcase back into the house and sat at the dining room table, spreading the contents under the warm overhead light. Inside the case was an encrypted satellite laptop. It was thick, heavy, and completely untraceable. I opened the lid and typed in the 30-character alphanumeric passcode. The screen flickered to life, displaying a secure network portal. I did not need to guess what Cameron was up to. I needed absolute concrete proof. I needed a financial dossier so airtight that no expensive defense attorney could ever punch a hole in it. I picked up my phone, but I did not dial a local number. I dialed a secure line to a man who had orchestrated the creation of my blind trust 10 years ago. His name was Calvin Reed. Calvin was not a family lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a man who specialized in tracing hidden assets, uncovering offshore tax evasion, and dismantling hostile corporate takeovers. He was the kind of lawyer billionaires called when they needed someone professionally destroyed. The line rang twice before Calvin answered. His voice was sharp, awake, and immediately professional despite the late hour. "George," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "It has been a very long time. I thought you retired to play golf and tend to your garden." I poured myself a cup of cold black coffee from the morning pot, keeping my eyes locked on the glowing computer screen. "The garden is full of snakes, Calvin," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I need you to run a full comprehensive forensic audit on my stepson Cameron. I need you to pull his brokerage licenses, his corporate filings, his personal bank statements, and his tax returns for the last 6 years." Calvin did not ask why. He did not offer empty platitudes or ask about my day. He simply asked for the spelling of the legal name and the business address. I gave him the details of Cameron Investment Firm. "I want to know exactly how much debt he is carrying," I continued. "I want to know who his creditors are. I want to know if his business is actually generating revenue or if it is just a front. Most importantly, Calvin, I need you to find out what kind of financial deadline is approaching. He is desperate. He needs liquid cash, and he needs it immediately. Find the leak." Calvin promised he would have a preliminary dossier ready by morning. He warned me that breaking through corporate firewalls overnight would be expensive and highly unconventional. I told him to build the blind trust without limits and hung up the phone. I sat in the silent house listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I was a builder. I spent my life looking at blueprints, identifying stress points, and reinforcing vulnerable foundations. Cameron had built his entire scheme on the assumption that I was a weak structural link. He believed my grief and exhaustion would make me compliant. He failed to realize that pressure does not always break a foundation. Sometimes pressure turns soft coal into absolute diamonds. He thought he was the smartest person in the room, playing a long game of inheritance fraud. He had absolutely no idea he had just declared war on a man who held millions of dollars in untraceable capital and who possessed the exact engineering mindset required to systematically dismantle his entire life. I stared at the glowing laptop screen, waiting for Calvin's preliminary data to arrive. I needed to know exactly what Cameron was trying to steal, because once I knew his motive, I would know exactly how to trap him. The rain had not stopped by the time the sun began to bleed through the heavy gray clouds. I parked my old sedan behind a dilapidated diner on the industrial edge of the city, far away from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood and the sterile halls of the hospital. It was the kind of place where truck drivers and night shift workers drank bitter coffee in silence. It was exactly the kind of place where a man like Elias Reed looked entirely out of his element. I walked through the glass doors, shaking the water from my coat. Elias was already sitting in a corner booth wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the diner made in a month. His expensive leather briefcase rested on the cracked vinyl seat beside him. I slid into the booth across from him. The waitress dropped off a chipped mug of black coffee and walked away without asking for our order. Elias did not touch his cup. He just looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes that made him the most feared corporate attorney in my old circles. "You look terrible, George," he said, his voice low and smooth. I took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, letting the bitter taste ground me. "I feel like a man who just discovered his house is built on a sinkhole," I replied. "Tell me exactly how deep the rot goes, Elias." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, placing it squarely on the sticky table. He did not offer any sympathetic warnings. He knew I was an engineer. He knew I only cared about the raw data, the structural integrity of the problem. He told me that Derek was not a successful investment broker. He told me that my stepson was a parasite running a collapsing, localized Ponzi scheme. The words hung in the humid air of the diner, heavy and toxic. Elias opened the folder and spread several banking spreadsheets across the table. He explained that Derek had not actually invested a single dime of his client's money in over 3 years. Every time a new client handed over their retirement savings, Derek used those funds to pay the fabricated returns of his older investors, keeping the illusion of a highly profitable portfolio alive. The rest of the money, the missing millions, went directly into funding his extravagant life. The luxury vehicles, the tailored suits, the country club memberships, they were all paid for with stolen retirement funds from hardworking people who trusted him. He had built a house of cards, and a strong wind was finally blowing. I stared at the numbers, feeling a cold precision wash over me. It explained the arrogance, the desperate need to maintain appearances. But it did not explain the timing. "Why now?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Why try to kill his mother this week after 6 years of playing the devoted son? Elias pulled a highly classified internal memo from the stack and slid it toward me. He tapped his finger against a red stamp at the top of the page. "Because the Securities and Exchange Commission caught the scent," Elias explained. "They flagged his brokerage firm for severe irregularities last month. Derek received a confidential notice that federal auditors are descending on his office next Wednesday. They are going to demand to see the physical assets backing his clients' portfolios." Elias leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Derek has a $2 million shortfall, George. If he cannot produce $2 million in liquid cash by next Wednesday, the federal auditors will immediately freeze his firm. He will be arrested for wire fraud, securities fraud, and grand larceny. He is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The sheer desperation of the situation painted a sickeningly clear picture. He was a cornered rat facing absolute ruin, but he was not acting alone. I asked Elias about Natalie, about the high-end lifestyle brand she paraded all over social media. Elias let out a dry, humorless laugh. Natalie is in just as deep as he is George. Her business has never turned a profit. It is a vanity project hemorrhaging cash. To keep it afloat, she took out massive commercial loans, using Derek fraudulent investment accounts as collateral. If Derek falls, the banks will instantly audit Natalie. She will be indicted for bank fraud right alongside him. She knows exactly what is happening, and she is just as desperate to find a financial lifeline. That is why they came to your house yesterday. That is why they pushed so hard for the reverse mortgage on your property. They needed your equity to plug the hole in their sinking ship. I looked down at the coffee in my mug, watching the dark liquid ripple. They needed the house equity, I murmured, calculating the sum in my head. But a reverse mortgage on my suburban home would only yield maybe $300,000. That is not nearly enough to cover a $2 million deficit. They would still go to prison. I looked back up at Elias. They are missing $1.7 million. Where did they think the rest of the cash was coming from? Elias reached into the very bottom of his leather briefcase. His expression shifted from analytical to something deeply somber. He pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve. He placed it gently on the table between us. I looked down. It was a legal document bearing the official blue stamp of the county clerk's office. It was a last will and testament. I read the header and felt the breath leave my lungs. It was Cynthia Will. Elias explained that his investigators found it filed in the county records just 2 weeks ago. I read the paragraphs, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. The document explicitly revoked all previous wills. It completely disinherited me, claiming I had been emotionally abusive and negligent in her care. It named Derek as the sole executor and sole beneficiary of her entire estate. But the most damning part was the specific inclusion of a massive life insurance policy. A policy I had purchased for Cynthia 30 years ago, which was now valued at exactly $1.7 million. Combined with the equity of my house, it was exactly the $2 million they needed to survive the federal audit. I stared at the bottom of the page. There on the signature line was Cynthia's name. It was signed in blue ink, a perfect replica of her elegant flowing handwriting. I felt my chest tighten with a rage so absolute it threatened to break me in half. Cynthia had been completely paralyzed for 6 years. She lacked the motor function to hold a spoon, let alone sign a complex legal document with perfect penmanship. Derek had forged her signature. He had fabricated a legal narrative painting me as a monster to justify stealing her life insurance. He filed the paperwork for her death 2 weeks before he administered the final lethal dose of poison. He had orchestrated her murder with terrifying bureaucratic precision. Elias watched me process the magnitude of the betrayal. He asked me what I wanted to do. He offered to call the district attorney immediately to have them arrested for the forgery and the attempted murder. He told me we had enough evidence to put them away before the sun went down. I looked at the forged signature of my dying wife. I thought about the sheer arrogant cruelty required to slowly poison the woman who gave him life just to cover his own pathetic financial failures. I slowly slid the forged will back across the table to Elias. I told him not to call the police yet. I told him that an immediate arrest would be too merciful. They would hide behind expensive lawyers and plead temporary insanity due to financial stress. I wanted them to feel the exact same slow, suffocating paralysis they had inflicted on my wife. I wanted them to believe they had won right up until the very moment their entire world collapsed around them. I stood up from the diner booth, leaving a wrinkled bill on the table. I instructed Elias to prepare the eviction notices for Derek commercial office space, which was unknowingly leased through my blind trust. I told him to draft the absolute destruction of their lives. I was going back to the hospital. I needed to ensure Cynthia was safe because tonight I was going to let Derek and Natalie walk right into a trap they could never escape. The rain finally broke, leaving the suburban streets smelling of wet asphalt and blooming magnolias. I pulled my sedan into a church parking lot about 3 blocks from my house. The silence in the car was heavy, filled only by the rhythmic thumping of my heart. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and tapped the application I had installed just 3 hours prior. The screen split into 4 high-definition feeds. I had spent the morning hardwiring micro-cameras into the smoke detectors of my own home. One in the living room, one pointing directly at my study desk, one in the master bedroom, and one covering the kitchen. I was no longer a husband returning to a sanctuary. I was an engineer monitoring a structural breach. I had called Cameron from the hospital waiting room an hour ago. I made my voice sound hoarse and defeated. I told him Cynthia was stable but heavily sedated, and that I was going to sit by her bed for the entire day. I told him I couldn't leave her side. I knew exactly what that phone call would trigger. It was an engraved invitation, an all-access pass to an empty house. 10 minutes later, a silver Mercedes SUV rolled into my driveway. I watched on my phone screen as Cameron and Monica stepped out. They didn't knock. Cameron used the spare key I had given him 5 years ago, back when I thought he was a son coming to visit his ailing mother. Now watching him turn the lock on the high-definition feed, he looked exactly like what he was, a burglar, entering an unguarded vault. They stepped into the hallway. Monica immediately began complaining, her voice captured perfectly by the audio receivers. She said the place smelled like old people and sadness. She told Cameron to hurry up because she had a Pilates class at noon. Cameron didn't respond to her complaints. He was moving with a frantic, focused energy. He didn't walk toward Cynthia's room to look for medical documents or contact lists for her specialists. He bypassed the living room entirely and headed straight for my study. I watched on the second camera feed as Cameron began tearing through my desk. He wasn't gentle. He pulled out drawers, dumping decades of utility bills, tax returns, and warranty manuals onto the hardwood floor. He was looking for the original deed to the house. He was looking for the hard copies of Cynthia's life insurance policies. He needed the physical documents to complete the fraudulent transfer of assets before the federal auditors descended on his firm next week. His desperation was palpable. He was sweating his expensive tie loosened, muttering curses as he sifted through the mundane paperwork of my life. In the master bedroom, the third camera feed showed Monica. She was standing in front of Cynthia's antique cherry wood vanity. My heart clenched as she casually slid open the top drawer. That was where Cynthia kept the jewelry inherited from her grandmother, a diamond tennis bracelet, a sapphire pendant, pieces that held generations of memories. Monica didn't look at them with admiration or respect. She looked at them like a pawnshop appraiser. I watched in cold, silent rage as she casually scooped the velvet boxes into her oversized designer handbag. She was stealing from a woman she believed was dying in a hospital bed a few miles away. She was looting a corpse before it was even cold. Back in the study, Cameron let out a sharp, victorious sound. He had found the bottom drawer, the one I intentionally left unlocked. He pulled out a thick manila folder. I had spent an hour meticulously crafting the contents of that folder before I left the house. He spread the papers across my desk. They were banking statements, perfectly forged, highly convincing financial documents, bearing the logo of a prominent national bank. Cameron pulled his phone out and snapped several pictures of the documents. He yelled for Monica. She walked into the study, the stolen jewelry heavy in her bag. Cameron pointed at the papers, his voice shaking with pure, unrestrained greed. He told her I had been hiding money. He pointed to a specific line on the fake statement. It indicated a safety deposit box at a downtown branch, explicitly listing the contents as $500,000 in untraceable municipal bonds. I watched Monica's eyes widen. I watched her greed instantly eclipse her impatience. She asked Cameron if he had the power of attorney documents. Cameron smiled, a dark, predatory smile that made my stomach turn. He told her the power of attorney wouldn't work for a physical safety deposit box. He said he needed the physical key, and he needed it before I realized the documents were missing. He began tearing through the remaining drawers with renewed frantic energy, searching for a small brass key that did not exist. They spent another 20 minutes ransacking my home, pulling books off shelves, checking under the mattress, looking for a key to a vault filled with phantom money. They left the house looking like a disaster zone, papers, scattered drawers upended. Cameron didn't find the key, but he had taken the bait. He had the fake account numbers, the bank branch location, and the absolute certainty that $500,000 was sitting in a metal box with my name on it. I watched them get back into their SUV and speed away. I didn't feel sadness anymore. The betrayal had burned away all the grief, leaving only a cold, sharp clarity. They thought they had found a hidden treasure. They thought they had discovered my final desperate secret. They had absolutely no idea that I had just handed them a map leading straight into the center of an inescapable trap. They were out of time, they were desperate, and now they were going to make a catastrophic mistake. I arrived back at the hospital just as the evening shift was settling in. The smell of cafeteria food and industrial cleaner hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of Cynthia's new room in the intensive care unit. Dr. Evans was waiting for me outside her door, holding a chart that actually contained some measure of hope for the first time in 6 years. He looked at me, a genuine smile breaking through his professional exhaustion. The chelating agents were working. The heavy metals were binding and flushing from her system. He told me that earlier that afternoon, Cynthia had managed to move her left index finger voluntarily. She had also opened her eyes and seemed to track movement across the room. It was a microscopic victory, a tiny spark of life returning to a body that had been systematically shut down, but to me, it was a miracle. It meant she was fighting her way back. It meant the poison had not caused irreversible brain damage. It meant Cameron's plan was unraveling faster than he could possibly imagine. I thanked Dr. Evans, my voice catching in my throat, overwhelmed by a sudden fierce protectiveness. I asked him to maintain the absolute lockdown on her room, reiterating that no one under any circumstances was allowed entry without my explicit in-person authorization. He nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation, without needing the horrifying details of my family's betrayal. I stepped into Cynthia's room. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was no longer a countdown to her demise, but a steady drumbeat of her recovery. She was sleeping, her chest rising and falling with a strength I hadn't seen in years. The pallor of her skin seemed less severe, the dark circles under her eyes less pronounced. I sat by her bed, taking her fragile hand in mine, feeling the warmth returning to her skin. I silently promised her that I would not only protect her, but that I would dismantle the lives of the monsters who had tried to steal hers. My quiet vigil was shattered less than an hour later. The heavy wooden door to the ICU hallway swung open violently, hitting the wall stopper with a loud crack that made me jump. Cameron strode into the room, his face a mask of furious determination, followed closely by a nervous-looking man holding a leather briefcase. The man had the shifty, uncomfortable demeanor of someone who knew he was somewhere he shouldn't be. Cameron completely ignored me, zeroing in on the bed where Cynthia lay resting. He bypassed the visitor's chair and moved straight to the side of the bed, his voice sharp and demanding as he called her name, trying to rouse her from her healing sleep. I stood up immediately, stepping between Cameron and my wife. I demanded to know what he was doing, keeping my voice low, but lacing it with the frantic, protective paranoia of a terrified husband. Cameron glared at me, his patience completely evaporated. He did not bother with the fake concern this time. He gestured sharply to the nervous man behind him. He told me he had brought a notary. He said he was not going to wait for me to find my reading glasses or for the hospital administration to drag their feet. He insisted that Cynthia needed to be transferred tonight, and he had brought the necessary legal documents to bypass my authorization. He needed her thumbprint or a crude signature on the medical proxy form, claiming she had moments of lucidity and could legally consent to the transfer. The audacity of his plan was staggering. He intended to physically force his barely conscious mother to sign away her own life to her executioner, aided by a corrupt notary who was clearly being paid to look the other way. I looked at the notary, who was already pulling a stack of papers and an ink pad from his briefcase, refusing to make eye contact with me. I stepped closer to Cameron, physically blocking his path to the bed, my chest almost touching his. I let the persona of the weak, confused old man drop just enough to show him the unyielding steel underneath. I told him he was not touching her. I told him he was not bringing strange men into her room to force signatures while she was fighting for her life. Cameron's face contorted in rage. He stepped into my space, trying to use his height and physical presence to intimidate me. He hissed that I was being ridiculous, that I was a senile old fool who was actively harming her chances of recovery by keeping her in this public hospital. He threatened to call the hospital administration to claim I was emotionally unstable and obstructing necessary medical care. He reached past me, trying to grab Cynthia's hand, desperate to force her thumb onto the ink pad. I slammed my hand down on his wrist, gripping it with a strength born of decades of manual labor and pure, unadulterated fury. I did not raise my voice, but the tone I used was cold enough to freeze water. I told him that if he did not step back immediately, I would hit the emergency call button. I told him I would scream for hospital security and have him and his corrupt notary physically dragged out of the building. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I would file a restraining order right here from the hospital floor, barring him from ever coming within 100 feet of his mother again. Cameron froze, his eyes widening slightly as he felt the vice-like grip on his wrist. For a split second, I saw the shock register on his face. He realized he was not dealing with a fragile, compliant victim anymore. He saw the wall he had hit, and he knew he could not break through it without causing a massive public scene. He yanked his arm back, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic. The notary, sensing the escalating volatility of the situation, hurriedly shoved his papers back into his briefcase and backed toward the door, clearly eager to escape the confrontation. Cameron pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice shaking with a barely contained desperation. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He said I had no idea what I was doing, that I was signing her death warrant by keeping her here. He glared at me, his eyes promising a brutal retaliation, before turning and storming out of the room, the notary scrambling behind him. I stood in the quiet room, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had won the standoff, but the encounter had revealed a terrifying truth. Cameron was no longer playing the long game. The careful, meticulous poisoning had failed, and his financial deadline was rapidly approaching. The attempt to force a signature with a corrupt notary was a desperate, sloppy move. He was abandoning caution. He was out of time, and a desperate predator is the most dangerous kind. I turned back to Cynthia, who was still resting peacefully, completely unaware of the war being waged over her hospital bed. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and now the predator was cornered. It was time to close the jaws. The cold interior of my car offered a temporary refuge from the suffocating atmosphere of the hospital. I sat behind the steering wheel, watching the rain wash over the windshield, allowing the adrenaline from the confrontation in the intensive care unit to slowly dissipate. I had successfully blocked my stepson and his corrupt notary from forcing my paralyzed wife to sign her own death warrant, but the victory was entirely temporary. Cameron was panicking. His meticulously planned timeline had ruptured, and his desperate attempt to bypass hospital security proved he was completely out of time. The physical threat to Cynthia was neutralized for the moment, shielded behind guarded hospital doors, but the paper threat still loomed large. I opened my encrypted satellite laptop, resting it on the passenger seat. The screen glowed in the dim light, displaying the digital copy of the forged last will and testament that my corporate attorney Calvin had uncovered. I stared at the document, analyzing it not as a grieving husband, but as a structural engineer examining a faulty blueprint. The forgery of my wife's signature was impressive, mimicking the elegant loops she used to make before the poison systematically destroyed her motor functions. But a signature alone could not legally transfer an entire estate and a massive life insurance policy. It required official authentication. My eyes locked onto the blue notary stamp pressed firmly into the bottom corner of the heavy parchment. A notary seal is the legal bedrock of any binding document, verifying that the individual signing the paper was physically present, properly identified, and acting of their own free will. Cynthia had not left her medical bed in our living room for over a year, let alone visited a public notary office. That blue ink stamp was the critical structural weakness in Cameron Grand design. If I could shatter the credibility of that single official seal, the entire fraudulent inheritance would instantly collapse, transforming a civil dispute into a sweeping federal indictment for forgery and criminal conspiracy. I needed to dismantle that stamp, and I knew exactly who could help me do it. I needed an operative who functioned entirely outside the slow bureaucratic delays of the standard legal system. I picked up my phone and dialed a secure number I had not called in over a decade. I reached out to a man named Russell. Decades ago, Russell was the most ruthless independent structural inspector on the eastern seaboard. He was the man I hired when corrupt contractors tried to cut corners on massive bridge foundations or bury shoddy steelwork under layers of concrete. Russell had an absolute gift for finding the lies people buried in the dark. 10 years ago, he had transitioned his obsessive attention to detail into the private investigation sector, serving high-net-worth corporate clients. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice gravelly and immediately alert, despite the late hour. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Russell I had a completely fabricated structural blueprint, and I needed to locate the man who officially signed off on the fraudulent inspection. I transmitted the high-resolution scan of the forged will directly to Russell's encrypted server, directing his focus to the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. The name on the official seal belonged to an independent tax preparation and notary service operating within the city limits. I instructed Russell to find out everything about this man, his business, his associates, and exactly how much it cost to buy his official state seal. I authorized Russell to utilize the blind trust funds without any financial restrictions, telling him that I needed concrete, actionable intelligence before the sun went down. Russell simply confirmed the receipt of the file and disconnected the line. I put the car in gear and drove away from the hospital, taking the long, circuitous route through the city. I needed to keep moving, to keep my mind locked entirely on the mechanics of the trap rather than the agonizing reality of my wife lying in an intensive care bed, recovering from years of systematic poisoning. I thought about the sheer breathtaking arrogance required to forge a dying woman's signature. Cameron believed he was entirely untouchable, insulated by his expensive, tailored suits, his fast-talking charm, and his illusion of wealth. He viewed me as a fragile, compliant old man who would simply fold under pressure. But a forgery is nothing more than a fragile lie written on paper, and paper incinerates easily when exposed to the correct source of heat. 4 hours later, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a quiet suburban park. I opened my laptop as my phone vibrated, indicating an incoming secure file transfer from Russell. He had not just found the corrupt notary, he had completely dissected the man's entire operation. The notary business was located in a decaying, heavily vandalized strip mall on the industrial edge of the city. The office was sandwiched between a high-interest cash advance lender and a discount liquor store with barred windows. It was the perfect invisible ecosystem for a man willing to sell his professional credentials to the highest desperate bidder. Russell had bypassed the traditional requirement for a police warrant. Utilizing his own highly aggressive methods of persuasion and a substantial amount of untraceable cash, he had acquired the closed-circuit security footage from the liquor store next door. The camera angle pointed directly at the entrance of the cramped notary office, capturing everyone who entered and exited the premises. Russell had attached the video file along with a meticulously detailed chronological timeline. I clicked on the video file, my chest tightening with cold anticipation. The digital timestamp in the upper corner of the screen read exactly 2 weeks ago, matching the precise date printed on the forged last will and testament. The black and white surveillance footage showed Cameron, unmistakable luxury sports utility vehicle, pulling roughly into the cracked asphalt parking lot. Cameron stepped out of the driver's side door, looking paranoid, and rushed. He was holding a thick, bulging manila envelope tightly against his chest. He looked over his shoulder, scanning the empty parking lot, before ducking quickly into the dingy notary office. The camera maintained a steady, unforgiving gaze on the glass door for exactly 22 minutes. When Cameron finally emerged, he was moving with a frantic, relieved energy. He was no longer carrying the thick, bulging envelope, which I knew undoubtedly contained thousands of dollars in stolen cash, to bribe the official. Instead, he was holding a single folded document, carefully sliding it into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket before speeding away into the afternoon traffic. The visual evidence was absolute. It was a flawless capture of a criminal transaction. I cross-referenced the video timestamp with the detailed medical logs I kept for Cynthia Care. On that exact date at that exact hour, Cynthia was entirely comatose. She was hooked to a specialized home ventilator in our living room, heavily sedated following one of the severe toxic reactions caused by the heavy metal poison Cameron had been secretly feeding her. It was physically, medically, and geographically impossible for her to have been standing in that seedy industrial strip mall, presenting her identification to a notary public. The strict legal requirement for an in-person signature verification had been blatantly violated. Cameron had purchased a fraudulent official seal to legitimize his theft, believing there would be no witnesses. The surveillance video was the final devastating piece of forensic evidence I needed. Combined with the hospital toxicology reports, the financial dossier proving his collapsing Ponzi scheme, and the hidden audio recordings of his desperate home invasion, the trap was now completely inescapable. The steel doors of the cage were ready to slam shut permanently. Cameron had built a fragile house of cards, relying entirely on my perceived ignorance, and I was holding the match that would burn his entire life to ash. A cold sense of absolute calm washed over me. The frantic, terrified husband persona was no longer necessary. I had every weapon I needed to end this war tonight. Just as I reached to close the laptop, my phone screen illuminated with an incoming text message. It was from Cameron. The message was short, completely devoid of any fake familial warmth, and dripping with urgent, hostile desperation. He stated that the hospital administration was asking too many questions and that they needed to sort out the legalities immediately before the state forced a decision on her medical care. He demanded a mandatory family meeting at my house that evening at 8 o'clock, insisting they needed to finalize the paperwork once and for all. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the arrogant demand of a predator walking willingly into an execution chamber. I typed a single word in reply, acknowledging the meeting. I put the phone down and drove toward the house. It was time to prepare the demolition. I arrived back at the house just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawn. The quiet of the neighborhood felt deceptive, a calm surface masking the absolute turbulence churning just beneath it. I parked my car in the driveway and walked up the front steps, my mind operating with the cold, precise efficiency of a demolition expert calculating explosive charges. I was no longer the grieving, exhausted husband. I was the architect of my family's downfall, and tonight I was going to bring the entire structure down on their heads. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the suffocating silence of the house. The lingering scent of Monica's perfume had finally faded, replaced by the sterile smell of the medical supplies that had dominated our lives for the past 6 years. I walked directly into the living room, my eyes scanning the space with analytical detachment. I moved to the smoke detector mounted high on the wall, reaching up to adjust the microscopic lens I had installed that morning. I checked the feed on my phone, ensuring the camera captured the entire seating area, specifically focusing on the large oak coffee table in the center of the room. I wanted no blind spots. I wanted every facial expression, every lie, every desperate threat recorded in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. I moved to the study, repeating the process, making sure the camera covering my desk had an unobstructed view of the doorway. I walked through the kitchen, checking the audio receivers hidden behind the crown molding. The surveillance network was flawless, a silent, invisible witness to the ambush I was preparing. I walked back into the living room and approached the coffee table. From my pocket, I pulled a small brass key. It was an old key, heavy and ornate, belonging to a lockbox I had discarded decades ago. I placed it deliberately in the center of the table, making sure it was the first thing they would see when they sat down. It was the bait, the physical manifestation of the phantom $500,000 they thought they had discovered during their frantic search earlier that day. It was the symbol of their greed, and it was going to be the anchor that dragged them to the bottom of the ocean. I walked into my study and sat behind the heavy oak desk. I unlocked the encrypted satellite laptop and opened the digital files Calvin had sent me. I spent the next hour meticulously reviewing the forensic financial dossier. I memorized the exact figures of Cameron's collapsing Ponzi scheme, the dates of the fraudulent transfers, the names of the desperate clients whose retirement savings he had stolen to fund his luxury cars and tailored suits. I reviewed the commercial loans Monica had taken out against those fraudulent accounts to keep her vanity lifestyle brand afloat. I studied the timeline of their financial ruin, overlaying it with the medical logs of Cynthia's deteriorating health. The correlation was terrifyingly precise. Every time Cameron's investments tanked, every time his debts mounted, Cynthia's symptoms miraculously worsened, accompanied by a new, more aggressive prescription from his hand-picked specialist. I pulled out the physical copy of the toxicology report Dr. Evans had provided. The stark black ink detailing the near-lethal levels of the synthetic heavy metal compound seemed to burn into the paper. It was the irrefutable proof of their monstrous cruelty, the undeniable evidence that they had traded a mother's life for financial salvation. I placed the report inside a plain manila folder, setting it squarely in the center of my desk. Beside it, I placed the high-resolution photographs of Cameron exiting the seedy notary office in the industrial park. The thick envelope of bribe money clutched to his chest. I wasn't preparing for an argument. I wasn't planning a tearful confrontation or a desperate plea for them to change their ways. I was preparing for an absolute devastating annihilation. I was going to surgically dismantle their lies, their illusions of wealth, and their arrogant belief that they could outsmart me. The silence of the house was suddenly broken by the crunch of gravel in the driveway. I glanced at the live feed on my phone. The silver Mercedes SUV had pulled up, the headlights cutting through the growing darkness. But they hadn't come alone. As the doors opened, I watched Cameron and Monica step out, their faces set in grim lines of determination. Behind them, a third figure emerged from the back seat. It was a man I didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp pinstriped suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He had the slick, aggressive posture of a man who made a living out of intimidating people, the kind of lawyer who thrived on threats and legal bullying. They had brought reinforcements. They thought they were walking into a negotiation with a confused, vulnerable old man. They thought they were bringing a shark to a goldfish bowl. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark, and stood up from my desk. The trap was set. The bait was in place. The predators had arrived, completely unaware that they were stepping directly into the crosshairs. I walked toward the front door, the cold, calculating calmness settling over me like a suit of armor, ready to open the door and welcome them to the end of their lives. The doorbell echoed through the silent house, a sharp, intrusive sound that signaled the beginning of the end. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the heavy footsteps on the porch. I didn't rush. I walked slowly to the front door, pulling it open to reveal the three people who believed they held all the cards. Cameron stood in the center, his posture radiating a false sense of authority, flanked by Monica and the man in the pinstriped suit. They didn't wait for an invitation. The lawyer pushed past me, his leather briefcase hitting my shoulder, stepping into the living room as if he already owned the property. Cameron and Monica followed, their eyes darting around the room, no doubt looking for the brass key I had strategically placed on the coffee table. "Let's get straight to business, George," the lawyer announced, dropping his briefcase onto the dining table with a loud thud. "My name is Vance Caldwell. I represent Cameron in all matters regarding the estate of Cynthia Barrett." He didn't offer his hand. He unlatched the briefcase, pulling out a stack of documents thick with legal jargon. Given your wife's critical medical condition, my client is asserting his primary rights as the biological son to assume immediate medical and financial guardianship. Caldwell leaned forward, planting his hands on the table, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. We are giving you official notice. You have 48 hours to vacate these premises. We have initiated the eviction process based on your inability to provide adequate care, and we are freezing all joint assets pending a full investigation into your negligence. The sheer arrogance of the man was almost comical, a performance entirely disconnected from reality. He was reciting threats from a script Cameron had written, completely unaware that he was standing in the middle of a meticulously designed trap. I didn't respond. I simply walked past him into the kitchen, picked up the glass coffee pot, and began pouring myself a cup. Monica scoffed loudly from the living room, kicking off her designer heels. "Honestly, George, you should be thanking us," she complained, her voice dripping with condescension. "This house is a disaster. It smells like a hospice. We're doing you a favor. Just hand over the keys and go find a cheap motel for a few weeks while we liquidate the assets. We need to pay for a proper care facility for Cynthia somewhere that actually knows what they're doing." She walked over to the coffee table, her eyes lighting up as she spotted the small brass key resting next to a stack of mail. She quickly snatched it up, shooting a triumphant look at Cameron. They thought they had won. They thought the phantom $500,000 in untraceable bonds was finally within their grasp. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the heat spread through my chest. I walked back into the living room, leaning against the doorframe, watching them revel in their imagined victory. The hidden cameras were capturing every word, every gesture, every ounce of their monumental greed. Caldwell mistook my silence for submission. He tapped a pen against the stack of papers. "Sign here, George. It's a voluntary surrender of property rights. If you fight this, we will drag you through a lengthy public court battle that will drain whatever meager savings you have left. Make it easy on yourself." I looked at Caldwell, then at Monica, who was slipping the brass key into her designer handbag. Finally, my gaze settled on Cameron. The confident, authoritative facade he had worn when he walked through the door was beginning to crack, replaced by a flicker of unease as he realized I hadn't argued, pleaded, or shown a single sign of fear. I set my coffee mug down on the table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. The silence stretched heavy and expectant before I finally spoke, my voice calm, precise, and absolutely devastating. "How much is the shortfall, Cameron? Is it 2 million or closer to 2.5? The question hung in the air of the living room, heavy and suffocating. How much is the shortfall, Cameron? Is it 2 million or closer to 2.5? Cameron completely froze. The smug, self-assured smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face since he confidently strolled through my front door evaporated in an absolute instant. The healthy color drained rapidly from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray that made him look like a hollow wax figure. For a terrifyingly long 10 seconds, the only sound in the house was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the exact moment his carefully constructed reality ceased to exist. He stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, trying frantically to process how the helpless, exhausted old man he fully intended to evict onto the street had just casually named the exact devastating price of his impending criminal indictment. Vance Caldwell, the aggressive pinstriped lawyer, immediately sensed his client losing total control of the room. He puffed out his chest and took a heavy step forward, opening his mouth to launch into another rehearsed barrage of legal threats and intimidation tactics. I did not even look at him. I simply raised my right hand, holding it up flat, steady, and utterly unwavering. I told Caldwell to remain absolutely silent if he wanted to walk out of this house with his license to practice law still intact. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of any anger or panic. I informed him that he was currently standing in the direct blast radius of a massive federal fraud investigation. I told him that every single word he spoke in defense of the man trembling beside him would be captured by the hidden microphones in the room, and handed directly to the district attorney tomorrow morning as concrete evidence of criminal conspiracy. Caldwell snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth clicked together. He was a professional predator, but he was not a fool. He recognized a man holding all the winning cards when he saw one. He glanced nervously at Cameron, then took a slow, cautious step backward physically and legally, distancing himself from his client. He gripped the handle of his leather briefcase, his knuckles turning white, looking around the living room, as if searching for the hidden cameras I had just confirmed were watching him. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out a sleek, black digital tablet. I placed it gently on the oak coffee table right next to the exact spot where the fake brass safety deposit box key had been resting just moments prior. I tapped the glass screen, illuminating the comprehensive forensic dossier that Elias had meticulously compiled over the last 48 hours. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the precise, methodical cadence of a structural engineer diagnosing the catastrophic failure of a collapsed bridge. I looked directly at Cameron and began to systematically dismantle his entire life. I detailed the exact architecture of his localized Ponzi scheme. I named the elderly clients whose retirement accounts he had drained to absolute zero. I read out the dates of the fabricated dividend reports he had mailed to trusting investors, while simultaneously using their hard-earned life savings to lease imported luxury sports cars and pay for extravagant country club memberships. I watched his breath hitch as I explained that I knew all about the confidential notice from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I told him I knew the federal auditors were scheduled to raid his brokerage firm the following Wednesday, and that he needed my house equity to cover the massive bleeding hole in his accounts. I then shifted my gaze to Monica, as the horrifying reality of my words began to penetrate her carefully curated vanity. She was sitting on the edge of the sofa, clutching her oversized designer handbag tightly against her chest, the very same bag that currently contained my paralyzed wife's stolen antique jewelry. I laid out the stark financial reality of her failing lifestyle brand. I explained how her business had never generated a single dollar of genuine profit since its inception. I told her I knew she had taken out massive commercial loans using Cameron fraudulent investment portfolios as collateral to maintain her illusion of success. I watched her perfectly made-up face contort in absolute horror as I explained the chain reaction. When the federal government seized Cameron assets, her business would be immediately liquidated by the banks, and she would be indicted for bank fraud right alongside her husband. Monica turned to Cameron, her voice trembling violently before pitching upward into a hysterical, desperate screech. She demanded to know if it was true. She grabbed his tailored sleeve, shaking his arm, begging him to tell her that I was just a crazy, vindictive old man making things up to scare them. But Cameron could not look her in the eye. He stared at the hardwood floor, his breathing ragged and shallow, his chest heaving with silent panic. The illusion of their infinite wealth had shattered completely, exposing the rotting, decaying framework underneath. Monica realized in that agonizing moment that he had lied to her about everything. She realized the lavish life she had been flaunting on social media was paid for with stolen money and forged documents. The marital loyalty they projected vanished instantly, replaced by a vicious primal instinct for self-preservation. She began to scream at him while calling him a liar, a pathetic failure, and a con artist who had destroyed her future. She told him she would divorce him immediately, that she would testify against him in federal court, and that she would do whatever it took to avoid going to a federal penitentiary. I let them turn on each other for a long moment, watching the foundation of their partnership crumble into dust right in my living room. Then I tapped the screen of the digital tablet again, bringing up the high-resolution scan of the legal document Elias had found buried in the county records. I raised my voice just enough to cut through Monica's hysterical sobbing. I told Cameron to look at the glowing screen. I told him I knew all about the newly drafted last will and testament filed just 2 weeks ago. I read the specific clauses aloud, the ones completely disinheriting me, claiming I was a negligent husband and leaving Cynthia's entire estate, including a $1.7 million life insurance policy, entirely to him. I pointed to the forged signature at the bottom of the digital page. an elegant, flawless imitation of a woman who had not been able to hold a pen or move her hands in 6 years. I then pulled up the timeline. This was the part that truly sickened me, the part that revealed the absolute bottomless depths of his depravity. I looked Cameron dead in the eyes and explained the horrifying correlation I had discovered in the data. I noted that exactly 6 years ago he had suffered his first major catastrophic financial loss in the market. He was facing his first potential bankruptcy and total public ruin. I paused, letting the crushing weight of the moment settle over the room, silencing even Monica cries. I told him that it was a fascinating coincidence that the very same month his fund initially collapsed was the exact same month his mother suffered her mysterious atypical stroke. I pointed out that every single time his debts mounted over the past 6 years, every time he needed a massive infusion of cash, her medical symptoms miraculously worsened, leading to a new, highly specific prescription from his hand-picked private specialist. Cameron finally snapped. The suffocating panic morphed into a cornered, desperate, animalistic rage. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the coffee table, his face flushed dark red with fury. He shouted that I was a senile, delusional old man inventing crazy conspiracy theories because I could not handle the stress of caring for a dying woman. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, screaming that I had no physical proof of anything, that the digital files were easily faked, and that he was going to take the house, the estate, and everything I owned. He yelled that he was her biological son, and the legal courts would always side with him over a paranoid, exhausted stepfather who was clearly losing his grip on reality. He was breathing heavily, spit flying from his lips, trying desperately to regain control of a room he had completely lost. Caldwell, the sleazy lawyer, was now actively backing toward the front door, his eyes darting frantically, looking for a safe escape route. Monica was curled into a ball on the sofa, rocking back and forth, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let Cameron scream until his voice cracked and his chest heaved with exhaustion. When he finally fell silent, panting and glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket one last time. I pulled out a folded piece of heavy medical parchment. It was not a digital file. It was a physical, certified legal document bearing the official embossed seal of the hospital and the signature of the emergency room attending physician. I unfolded the thick paper carefully, smoothing out the creases. I placed it flat on the coffee table directly over the glowing image of the forged will. It was the comprehensive blood panel and the complete toxicology report that Dr. Evans had run that evening. I slid the paper slowly across the smooth wooden surface until it rested inches from Cameron's trembling hands. I looked up at him, my voice dropping to a cold, deadly whisper that carried more weight than any violent shout ever could. You didn't just forge a will, Cameron. You poisoned your mother. The silence in the living room shattered the moment the word poisoned left my lips. Derek stared at the certified medical document resting on the coffee table. The heavy parchment seemed to radiate a gravitational pull, drawing every eye in the room toward the undeniable proof of his monstrous betrayal. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly pallor that made his expensive, tailored suit look like a costume draped over a decaying mannequin. For a fraction of a second, I saw the terrifying realization wash over him. He understood that his 6-year campaign of slow, meticulous murder had just been exposed in the most brutal, undeniable way possible. The transition from shock to survival instinct was instantaneous. Derek lunged across the oak table, his arm shooting out with frantic, desperate speed. He aimed his grasping fingers directly at the toxicology report, intending to snatch the physical evidence, tear it to pieces, or swallow it whole if he had to. But I was a man who spent his entire life calculating the breaking point of structural materials. I knew exactly how a compromised foundation behaved when exposed to extreme stress. I had anticipated his move the very second I placed the paper down. My hand shot forward, pinning his wrist to the hard wooden surface of the table before his fingers could even graze the edge of the document. I did not possess the raw, explosive strength of a desperate 38-year-old man, but I possessed the unyielding mechanical grip of a lifetime spent turning wrenches and pulling industrial levers. I clamped down on his wrist, pressing the bone against the oak until he gasped in sudden sharp pain. I looked directly into his panicked eyes, letting him see the absolute coldness in mine. I told him it did not matter if he tore that specific piece of paper into 1,000 unreadable shreds. I spoke slowly, enunciating every single syllable so the reality of his situation could bypass his arrogance and penetrate his thick skull. I explained that the document on the table was merely a visual aid provided for his personal illumination. I informed him that my corporate attorney, Elias Reed, had already taken possession of the original certified medical records directly from the hospital administration 3 hours ago. I watched the muscles in Derek's jaw clench as I outlined the exact trajectory of his impending doom. I told him that Elias had already dispatched secure digital copies and heavily sealed physical dossiers to 3 separate entities. The first package was sitting on the desk of the local police chief, detailing the attempted murder and the forged medical proxy. The second package was securely delivered to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, providing the final missing piece they needed for their massive financial fraud investigation. The third and most devastating package was hand-delivered to the district attorney, outlining the complete timeline of the forged will and the systemic poisoning of a vulnerable disabled woman. Vance Caldwell, the aggressive, sleazy lawyer who had confidently threatened to throw me onto the street just 20 minutes ago, finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his current environment. He was a bottom-feeding legal predator, but he knew better than to stand on the tracks when a federal freight train was approaching. Without uttering a single word of defense or farewell, Caldwell snatched his leather briefcase from the dining table. He moved with a pathetic, terrified haste, scrambling toward the front door and abandoning his client to face the absolute ruin I had orchestrated. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, echoing through the quiet house like the ceiling of a concrete vault. Natalie sat frozen on the sofa, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently in her lap. The illusion of her glamorous high society life was dissolving into ash right before her eyes. She looked at Derek not with the supportive gaze of a loving wife, but with the profound revulsion of a woman who just realized she was legally chained to a sociopathic criminal. She began to hyperventilate, her breath hitching in her throat as she realized the financial crimes, the bank fraud, and the impending federal indictments would drag her down right alongside him. She curled into the corner of the couch, crying silently, mourning the death of her vanity and the imminent loss of her freedom. Derek was entirely alone. The lawyer had fled. His wife had turned on him. The legal authorities were already closing in. He was a cornered rat trapped in a cage of his own making, and cornered rats only know one way to react. They bite. He yanked his arm free from my grip, stumbling backward and knocking a decorative chair to the hardwood floor. He stood tall, throwing his shoulders back and puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to physically intimidate me. He stepped into my personal space, towering over me, his eyes bloodshot and wide with pure, unadulterated madness. He bared his teeth, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. His voice dropped to a guttural, menacing growl, stripping away any remaining pretense of civility or familial affection. "You have nothing, old man," he spat the words, dripping with toxic venom. "You are a retired nobody living on a pathetic, fixed income. You think a few fake documents and a paranoid delusion can stop me? I will hire the best defense team in the state. I will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable life. I will take this house, I will liquidate every single asset you possess, and I will leave you to die on the street." I did not step back. I did not blink. I let his desperate, frantic threats wash over me like a light spring rain against a solid titanium bulkhead. He believed his illusion of wealth made him untouchable. He believed my worn flannel shirts and my 10-year-old sedan were undeniable proof of my vulnerability. He had judged a book solely by its cover, failing to realize the pages inside were forged from reinforced steel. I looked at his expensive tailored suit, and his imported Italian leather shoes, bought and paid for with the stolen retirement funds of innocent people. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to drop the final devastating payload. I told him he was fundamentally misunderstanding the structural dynamic of our relationship. I explained that I was not a simple retired civil engineer scraping by on Social Security checks. I told him about the late nights in my garage decades ago. I told him about the specialized structural safety valves I had invented to prevent catastrophic pressure failures in commercial aqueducts. I watched his eyes narrow in confusion as I explained that my patents were currently utilized in municipal infrastructure projects across the entire globe. I kept my voice incredibly calm, delivering the financial data with surgical precision. I informed him that I sold those exclusive patents 10 years ago for $15 million. I told him I placed every single penny of that immense wealth into an ironclad blind trust that his mother knew absolutely nothing about. I explained that I chose to live a modest, quiet life, not because I lacked resources, but because I wanted to protect our peaceful existence from the exact type of cancerous greed that was currently rotting his soul. Derek's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His brain could simply not process the monumental scale of his miscalculation. He had spent 6 years trying to murder his mother for a fraction of the wealth I possessed. I took one step forward, closing the distance between us, forcing him to look directly into the eyes of the man who had completely engineered his destruction. "I do not need this house, Derek," I said, my voice resonating with absolute terrifying authority. "I own the commercial building your brokerage operates out of, and I just evicted you." The revelation hung in the room like a suspended anvil. Derek stumbled backward, bumping into the heavy oak dining table as the sheer gravity of my words finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. I did not give him a single second to recover. I stepped forward, pressing my advantage, dismantling the rotting framework of his life beam by beam. I told him that my attorney, Elias Reed, had executed the termination clause on his commercial lease exactly 2 hours ago. The security guards at the downtown high-rise were currently boxing up his fake mahogany desk and changing the digital access codes to his office. He was locked out of his own fraudulent empire, but an eviction was merely the opening tremor of the earthquake. I kept my voice dead level, forcing him to absorb the absolute totality of his ruin. I explained that Elias had contacted the primary banking institutions holding Derek fraudulent investment accounts. Using the forensic financial dossier and the massive leverage of my blind trust, we triggered an emergency asset freeze. I watched his eyes dart wildly around the room as I told him that every single credit card in his wallet was currently declining. Every offshore account he thought he had cleverly hidden was locked down tight by federal authorities. The $2 million shortfall he desperately needed to cover before the auditors arrived next week was no longer his biggest problem. He had zero liquid capital to hire a defense attorney and zero means to flee the country. He was totally bankrupt. Natalie let out a choked, agonizing gasp from the corner of the sofa. She looked at Derek with a mixture of absolute disgust and sheer panic, realizing that the luxurious safety net she married him for had completely vaporized. She tried to stand up, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her oversized designer handbag onto the hardwood floor. The heavy velvet boxes containing Cynthia's stolen antique jewelry spilled out, scattering across the rug. I turned my attention to her, my gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. I told her not to bother gathering those boxes. I explained that I had been observing her actions through the hidden cameras long before tonight. I told her I knew exactly how she funded her failing lifestyle brand. I knew she had been inflating her business revenue using Derek's stolen investor funds to secure massive commercial loans. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, watching her shrink back against the cushions. I informed her that when she decided to invade my home and steal my wife's family heirlooms, she made a catastrophic miscalculation. I explained that I had already forwarded a comprehensive dossier detailing her corporate tax evasion and her fraudulent loan applications directly to the Internal Revenue Service. By tomorrow morning, federal agents would be seizing her inventory and auditing every single fake ledger she had ever filed. She was not just a victim of a lying husband. She was a fully complicit accessory to massive financial fraud, and she was going to face federal indictment right alongside him. The air in the living room grew thick, suffocating under the weight of the undeniable truth. Derek tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked toward Vance Caldwell, the aggressive pinstriped lawyer he had brought to intimidate me into surrendering my home. He reached out a trembling hand, begging his legal counsel to intervene to find some loophole or technicality that could save them from the impending slaughter. But Caldwell was a man who survived by recognizing when a ship was sinking. He looked at the medical toxicology report resting on the coffee table. He looked at the spilled stolen jewelry on the floor. He processed the reality that his client was the primary target of a massive multi-agency federal investigation involving grand larceny, elder abuse forgery, and attempted murder. The lawyer face turned a sickening shade of pale gray. He understood perfectly that if he uttered a single word in defense of Derek, he risked becoming implicated as an accessory to a sweeping criminal conspiracy. Without making a single sound, Caldwell reached down and grabbed the handle of his leather briefcase. He did not look at Derek. He did not look at Natalie. He simply turned his back on them, snapping the brass locks of his briefcase shut with a sharp, definitive click. Derek grabbed Caldwell's tailored sleeve, pleading with him, demanding that he do his job. Caldwell violently yanked his arm free, his eyes wide with self-preserving terror. He told Derek that he no longer represented him. He stated clearly and loudly for the hidden microphones that he had absolutely no prior knowledge of any criminal activity, and he was formally withdrawing his counsel effective immediately. Caldwell practically sprinted toward the front door, tearing it open, and disappearing into the dark, rainy night, leaving the door wide open behind him. The abandonment was absolute. Derek and Natalie were left entirely isolated, standing in the wreckage of their own arrogant greed. The predators who had strutted into my home believing they were going to easily devour a weak old man had been completely stripped of their fangs. They were nothing more than cornered prey, shivering in the harsh light of their own consequences. Derek collapsed onto his knees, his expensive trousers absorbing the dust and dirt from the entryway floor. He buried his face in his hands, weeping with loud, pathetic sobs. He begged me to forgive him. He swore he never wanted to hurt his mother, claiming the financial pressure had driven him temporarily insane. He pleaded with me to use my wealth to pay off his investors to make the federal charges disappear. He promised he would walk away and never bother us again if I just gave him a second chance. I looked down at the man I had raised since he was 10 years old. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering parental affection. I only saw the monster who had methodically poisoned the woman I loved, the monster who had forged her signature while she lay paralyzed and fighting for every breath. I told him that second chances were reserved for those who made honest mistakes. I told him that systematically destroying a human life for financial gain was a choice and evil calculated decision made over 6 agonizing years. Natalie crawled across the floor, grabbing my pant leg, her makeup smeared, running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She begged me to spare her, claiming Derek had forced her into everything, claiming she was just a victim of his manipulation. I stepped back, pulling my leg free from her grasping fingers. I reminded her that she had happily spent the stolen money wearing the designer clothes and drinking the expensive wine paid for with the life savings of innocent people and the slow, agonizing death of my wife. She was equally responsible, and she would pay an equal price. I walked back to the kitchen counter and picked up my coffee mug. The liquid was cold, but I took a slow, deliberate sip anyway. I looked at the clock on the wall, watching the second hand sweep precisely across the dial. Elias Reed, my attorney, was a man who appreciated perfect timing. I told Derek and Natalie that they had entirely run out of time. I told them that the conversation was officially over and that the structural collapse of their lives was now entering its final phase. Derek looked up, his tear-streaked face twisted in confusion and rising panic. He asked me what I meant. He asked what else I could possibly do to them. I did not answer him. I simply set my coffee mug down and gestured toward the open front door. The quiet suburban night was suddenly pierced by a sharp wailing sound in the distance. The noise grew louder, multiplying, echoing through the damp trees and bouncing off the asphalt streets. It was the unmistakable shrill cry of police sirens rapidly approaching our neighborhood. Red and blue lights began to strobe against the dark, cloudy sky, casting frantic, shifting shadows across the walls of my living room. The authorities had arrived, perfectly coordinated by Elias, exactly as we had planned. The trap had finally slammed completely shut. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the darkness of the front yard, casting erratic shadows across the walls of my living room. The wail of the sirens cut off abruptly, replaced by the harsh crackle of police radios and the heavy rhythmic sound of combat boots marching up my driveway. The front door remained wide open, exactly as the fleeing lawyer had left it, allowing the cold night air to sweep into the house. 3 uniformed officers stepped through the threshold, followed closely by a plainclothes detective holding a leather binder. Their presence instantly commanded the room, sucking the remaining oxygen from the space and leaving Derek and Natalie completely paralyzed in the center of the floor. The lead detective stepped forward, his eyes quickly scanning the scattered documents on the coffee table and the velvet jewelry boxes spilled across the rug. He looked at me, identifying me immediately as the owner of the house and the man who had coordinated this entire operation through Elias. I remained perfectly still, holding my ground, with the calm, steady demeanor of a man who had already won the war. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small silver USB drive. It was a tiny, insignificant-looking piece of metal, but it carried the explosive payload required to level a human life to dust. I held the drive out to the detective, and my voice was smooth and unwavering as I explained exactly what digital evidence he was about to receive. I told him the drive contained high-definition security footage from multiple hidden cameras positioned throughout my home. I explained that it held crystal-clear video of the 2 individuals standing before him, actively burglarizing my property, searching for financial documents, and pocketing my paralyzed wife's stolen antique jewelry. I informed the detective that the audio files captured every single desperate threat Derek had made tonight, including his arrogant declarations of intent to seize my assets and leave me destitute. I then pointed to the thick medical parchment resting on the coffee table, instructing the detective to bag it as the primary forensic evidence of systemic heavy metal poisoning. The reality of the physical evidence finally broke through Derek's state of shock. He watched the detective bag the toxicology report and pocket the USB drive, and his entire body began to violently tremble. He snapped out of his silent stupor and launched into a frenzied, pathetic display of desperate denial. He threw his hands up, taking a frantic step toward the detective, shouting that the entire situation was a massive setup. He yelled that I was a manipulative, crazy old man who had fabricated the videos and forged the medical documents to ruin his successful career. He screamed that he loved his mother and would never hurt her, claiming that I was the one who was negligent and abusive. The officers did not hesitate. They had dealt with cornered narcissistic predators thousands of times before, and they recognized the frantic flailing of a guilty man. 2 large uniformed officers moved swiftly across the living room, grabbing Derek by the shoulders and forcefully spinning him around. He thrashed against their grip, kicking at the hardwood floor and continuing to scream his fabricated innocence. He yelled that he had a right to a lawyer, that his firm managed millions of dollars, and that he would have all of their badges for this outrage. His arrogant threats were entirely useless against the cold, unforgiving reality of the law. The officers slammed him face first against the wall, effortlessly subduing his desperate struggle. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs, locking tightly around his wrists, echoed loudly through the room, severing his freedom permanently. Natalie watched her husband being pinned against the wall, and her fragile composure completely disintegrated. She scrambled backward away from the officers, her designer dress catching on the edge of the coffee table. She fell to her knees, weeping loudly, and hysterically, her tears ruining her expensive makeup. She clasped her hands together, pleading directly with the lead detective, swearing that she knew absolutely nothing about any poison or forged wills. She cried that she was just a devoted wife who had been entirely manipulated by a lying husband. She begged for mercy, claiming she only wanted to help pay for her mother-in-law medical care and that she was completely innocent of any violent crimes. The detective looked down at her with an expression of absolute professional apathy. He pulled a small card from his pocket and began to calmly recite her Miranda rights, reading them over her deafening sobs. He did not care about her designer clothes or her tears. He explicitly informed her that she was being placed under arrest for grand larceny, bank fraud, and criminal conspiracy to commit murder. The inclusion of the word murder hung in the air, a brutal, crushing weight that finally forced Natalie to understand the catastrophic severity of her actions. She was not going to a white-collar holding facility for tax evasion. She was going to a federal penitentiary as a fully complicit accomplice to the slow, agonizing poisoning of a disabled woman. An officer stepped forward, pulling her arms roughly behind her back and securing her wrists in steel cuffs while she continued to wail uncontrollably on the living room floor. The officers hauled them to their feet, dragging them toward the open front door. Derek was still shouting, cursing my name, and promising a violent revenge that he would never be in a position to deliver. Natalie was sobbing so hard her legs could barely support her weight, forcing the officers to practically carry her over the threshold. I stood quietly, in the center of the living room, watching the pathetic procession move out onto my front porch. Through the large bay window, I could see the flashing lights illuminating the faces of several neighbors who had stepped out onto their lawns, drawn by the noise and the spectacle. The people who Derek and Natalie had always tried to impress the suburban audience they had constantly performed for were now bearing witness to their absolute social and criminal destruction. I felt no overwhelming surge of joy as I watched them being shoved into the back of the reinforced police cruisers. There was no triumphant smile on my face and no desire to gloat over their ruined lives. Gloating is a behavior reserved for petty men playing small games. I was a man who had simply identified a lethal structural flaw in my family and executed the necessary demolition to prevent a total collapse. I watched the police cruisers pull away from the curb, their sirens silent now, their flashing lights fading into the dark, rainy night, taking the monsters far away from my home. The house fell completely silent once again, but this time the silence felt clean and purified. The toxic presence that had suffocated my life for 6 years had been permanently eradicated. I walked over to the open front door, feeling the cool night breeze brush against my face. I grasped the heavy brass handle and pulled the solid oak door shut, turning the deadbolt with a satisfying, definitive click. I moved through the living room, picking up the scattered velvet jewelry boxes and placing them securely in my pocket. I walked into the kitchen, rinsing my coffee mug in the sink and setting it carefully on the drying rack. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the hallway hook, slipping it over my shoulders. The silent adjustment was complete. The predators were locked in cages, and my territory was entirely secure. I walked out the back door, heading toward my car, preparing to return to the intensive care unit, where the woman I loved was waiting to finally begin her life again. The sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sunrise Valley Rehabilitation Center felt entirely different from the cold, synthetic light of the emergency room 6 months ago. The air here smelled of fresh pine and lavender, a deliberate and soothing contrast to the sharp chemical stench of the hospital. I sat in a plush, comfortable armchair placed right beside a wide, adjustable bed, watching the afternoon light dance across the polished hardwood floor. Outside the window, the world was painted in vibrant shades of green and gold, a visual symphony that perfectly mirrored the miraculous resurrection happening right inside this room. It had been exactly half a year since the sirens faded into the dark, rainy night, taking the toxic rot away from my home forever. Half a year since the devastating truth had shattered a 6-year nightmare. I looked down at the bed where the woman I loved was resting peacefully. Cynthia was no longer the frail, motionless prisoner trapped within the confines of her own failing body. The heavy metal poison that had systematically shut down her nervous system had been completely flushed from her veins thanks to the aggressive chelating therapies and the world-class specialists I had secured using the unlimited resources of the Blind Trust. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The pale, sickly gray hue of her skin had been replaced by a healthy, warm glow. The dark, sunken hollows beneath her eyes had vanished entirely. But the most beautiful change, the detail that brought tears to my eyes every single morning, was the return of her movement. Just last week, she had managed to lift her right arm entirely on her own. Yesterday, she had squeezed my hand with a grip that held a lifetime of unspoken gratitude. And this morning, as I was reading the newspaper to her, she had parted her lips and softly whispered my name. It was a fragile, raspy sound, but to my ears, it was the most powerful, triumphant roar I had ever heard. The structural integrity of her life had been restored. The facility itself was a masterpiece of medical architecture and compassionate care. Funded entirely by the $15 million trust it offered around-the-clock, personalized physical therapy, neurological rehabilitation, and a staff of nurses who treated Cynthia with the absolute utmost dignity and respect. I had purchased this level of care without a single second thought. The money I had hidden for a decade to protect us from Derek and his endless greed was now serving its ultimate intended purpose. It was buying back the time he had stolen from us. I watched her chest rise and fall in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The agonizing tremors, the terrifying seizures, and the silent screams of a woman locked in a chemical prison were gone forever. The doctors assured me that while the road to a full recovery would be long and require immense physical effort, the prognosis was overwhelmingly positive. The synthetic poison had caused functional disruption rather than permanent cellular death. She was going to walk again. She was going to talk again. We were going to have our life back. The monsters who had orchestrated her slow, agonizing demise were no longer a threat to anyone. They were completely and permanently neutralized. I had not attended the sentencing hearings because I had absolutely no desire to look at them ever again. My attorney, Elias Reed, had kept me informed of every legal development handling the fallout with the ruthless efficiency I paid him for. Derek, the charismatic investment broker, who thought he could outsmart an old civil engineer, was currently processing the brutal reality of a 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The financial authorities had ripped his localized Ponzi scheme apart, down to the final fraudulent penny. Every stolen retirement account had been identified, and his entire empire of lies was reduced to a mountain of criminal indictments. He would spend the next 2 decades confined to a concrete cell, stripped of his tailored suits, his luxury vehicles, and his arrogant delusions of grandeur. Natalie, the woman who had happily raided my home and stolen my family heirlooms while she thought Cynthia was dying, was not spared from the absolute devastation. The federal investigators had completely dismantled her vanity lifestyle brand, exposing the massive web of corporate tax evasion and fraudulent commercial loans she had used to keep it afloat. She was currently serving a 5-year sentence in a federal correctional facility for her role as an accessory to fraud and her complicity in the attempted murder. The glamorous high society life she had prioritized over basic human decency had evaporated entirely, leaving her with a criminal record and a coarse prison uniform. They had gambled everything on my perceived weakness, and they had lost absolutely everything in return. The sheer magnitude of Derek's betrayal still occasionally washed over me, but it no longer carried the stinging bite of grief. It had been replaced by a clinical understanding of his severe sociopathy. He had looked at the woman who adopted him, who fed him and housed him and loved him unconditionally, and he had seen nothing more than a human bank account waiting to be liquidated. He had calculated the exact dosage of heavy metal required to mimic a severe stroke, ensuring her decline was slow enough to avoid medical suspicion, but fast enough to solve his impending financial ruin. His arrogance was truly breathtaking. He truly believed that a tailored suit and a silver tongue made him invincible. He failed to comprehend that true power does not announce itself with a loud boast. True power operates in total silence, observing, collecting data, and waiting for the absolute perfect moment to strike. People often ask how a man can survive such a monumental betrayal without losing his mind to raw anger. They wonder how a husband can discover his wife is being slowly murdered by their own child and not immediately resort to physical violence. The answer is rooted in the very nature of my profession. If a bridge begins to collapse under the weight of a severe storm, you do not yell at the wind or punch the concrete. You analyze the structural failure, you evacuate the innocent, and you strategically demolish the compromised sections to prevent a total catastrophic loss of life. I did not seek a petty, noisy revenge. Revenge is an emotional reaction, a chaotic and unpredictable force that often destroys the victim right alongside the perpetrator. I sought a permanent resolution. I sought the total eradication of the threat. The silent adjustment was a calculated, necessary excision of a cancerous tumor. I gently picked up Cynthia's hand, wrapping my fingers around hers, feeling the steady, strong pulse beating beneath her warm skin. She opened her eyes slowly, the grogginess of sleep fading away, replaced by a sharp, brilliant clarity that I had missed for 6 long years. She looked at me, and the corners of her mouth turned upward into a soft, beautiful smile. There were no secrets left between us now. The blind trust, the hidden wealth, the terrifying reality of what her son had attempted to do, it had all been laid bare in the sterile light of truth. She knew everything, and she had squeezed my hand. In that simple, silent gesture, she told me she understood. She told me she felt safe. The predators were locked away in concrete cages, entirely powerless to ever harm us again. The storm had passed, and the foundation had held firm. I leaned forward and gently kissed her forehead, breathing in the clean scent of her skin. We had a long journey ahead of us, but for the first time in 6 years, we were walking it together, completely free from the shadows. I had protected what was mine. The war was officially over, and we had finally won our peace. The ultimate lesson from George and Cynthia's ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud threats or emotional outbursts, but in silence, patience, and unwavering clarity. Greed is a blinding force. It convinces predators that humility is a weakness and that aging equates to vulnerability. Derek and Natalie's fatal flaw was underestimating the profound strength forged by a lifetime of hard work, genuine love, and quiet observation. When faced with unimaginable betrayal, survival requires stepping back, analyzing the structural integrity of the threat, and dismantling it methodically. Compassion and kindness should never come at the cost of your own self-preservation. If this story of calculated justice and resilience resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments how you have stood strong against deception in your own life.